if you hunt deer, you should respect wolves because, right, those species were shaped because of the ecological relationship between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that we need to work into those dialogues.
What's up, everybody? JD here. Welcome to the Huntxp podcast in a special 3-episode drop, mostly about wolves. So let me give you a little bit of the backstory here. We reached out to our audience for suggestions of guests. They hooked us up with a guest named Steve Porter, who's our first episode here. We had this wide-ranging conversation, but we queued it up mostly to talk about wolves in Minnesota. We got into wolves and their relationship with hunters, how there's a lot of tension in Minnesota and other states. Why can't we hunt them? Why are their populations so high? That episode really sparked some curiosity, and we were like, hey, we want to hear directly from the DNR and learn more about their approach to wolves, particularly in Minnesota, but it has some translation to other states where wolves are as well. So we went and did that. And we reached out to the DNR, and they connected us with Dan Stark, who's the chief large carnivore specialist for Minnesota and is directly involved in helping the rebound of the wolf population in Minnesota. And there's tons of insights that he has to offer as well. And then Johnny and I just wanted to process what we had learned from these two guests. So what you're going to receive in this 3-episode drop is a couple different perspectives on what's going on with wolves in Minnesota as it relates to hunters. Why can't we hunt them? Why can't hunting be a part of it? How much do wolves actually play in the population of whitetail or other animals in Minnesota? We're going to get into all of that. It didn't fit into one episode. We're going to hear from different voices. Here's what I'd love for you to do. If you're a hunter or someone who just cares about wildlife, listen up to all these different perspectives, and we're giving you these different perspectives so that you can be more informed in your opinion and perspective, so that you can be a more informed hunter, so you can understand wolves better. And we'd love to hear from you. So let us know what you think about this, and hopefully you learn something. Hopefully you become a better hunter. Hopefully all these conversations help you level up your hunt. Let's jump into the episode. All right, Dan, you're here. Thanks for joining the Huntxp podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, for our listeners, can you give us a little introduction to yourself and your role with the DNR and with wolves?
Yeah, my name is Dan Stark. I am the large carnivore specialist for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and was hired in 2007 to implement the state wolf management plan. And that was following the first time that they came off the endangered species list. And as many people may be aware, that's been kind of a revolving thing over the last couple of decades. And we can probably get into that in more detail. Primarily manage and coordinate wolf activities in Minnesota with other agencies and within our department. And also work on our bear season management, do some of the policy related to bears and bear conservation in the state. And then I also, respond to reports and inquiries and information related to the cougars that show up here in the state as well. So we kind of track that information.
Nice.
And some of that has evolved over time since they were first taken off the list and gone back on and things like that. So I've had some additional duties assigned to me that, has expanded my role for the department.
I'm curious, where are cougars at these days in Minnesota? Like, are we seeing an increase, decrease? What's the population? Give us a brief update on them.
As far as a population goes, we have yet to document an established population. We have individuals that are roaming around the state, and all evidence indicates that it's animals that are dispersing from the western Dakotas or northwestern Nebraska, as is, documented by those animals being killed or genetic information that we can collect from samples when they do show up. We get, anywhere from 20 to 30 documented trail camera observations every year. That's kind of gone in. It kind of varies from year to year how many of those we get. Going back to like 2007 is really when we first had some of the first trail camera photos, and that's probably, as trail cameras are getting more common or more popular and people are using them more for scouting their hunting activity, that's just blown up, and so there's probably thousands of cameras out there on the landscape. We have had a number of individuals killed or hit by cars primarily that have shown up. Every one of those has been a male about around a year to 2 years of age. And based on the genetics, we can track, where their likely origin is from. And so based on samples from those populations in the Black Hills in western North Dakota and now in northwestern Nebraska, pretty much every one of them is traced back to there. The genetics is a little bit, you think that it's real detailed, like it'll tell you precisely what the origin is and maybe be able to compare that to the existing populations. But usually there's a probability associated with it. So it might say like, there's a 50% probability that it's from the Black Hills, but 20% probability it's from Wyoming or Montana or something like that. And that's just because all those animals have some trace back to those further west populations, so cougars first showed up in the Black Hills in probably the early 80s. And, within about 15 years, they had a pretty well established population of about 100 cougars there, but they had to come from somewhere too. And that source population was several hundred miles west of there in Wyoming.
That's cool.
We've got, a pretty significant distance from those populations now, and that's probably the limiting factor in them getting here. Mm-hmm. Males tend to disperse further than the females because females are tolerated, within their natal or adjacent to their natal range, whereas males are not, because an adult breeding male will cover an area, 5 to 10 times the area of females, and they breed with multiple females. So they're very territorial. They defend those territories and are trying to kind of protect those areas from other males. And so that's why you see these males just taking off and they're out there looking for an area that's unoccupied in search of a female. And the females don't go as far because they can set up a new territory just outside of where they're born. Females have some more overlap and are more tolerant of that. Probably the greatest example that we documented here in Minnesota was one back in 2009, went through the Twin Cities metro area, had multiple sightings of it. We were able to get samples from scat and, trace that origin back to the Black Hills. And then there were multiple places in Wisconsin that it was documented based on blood or hair. And then eventually it ended up in Connecticut and got hit by a car. So
that's wild.
It went from, likely origin in the Black Hills to Connecticut, a straight line distance of 1,700 miles. So
that's wild. And how old was it when it was killed?
It was probably about 3. It went through the Twin Cities in 2009. It was like December of 2009, and then hit by a car in May of 2011 in Connecticut.
Jeez, that's wild. Well, thanks for going down that tangent with me. That's fascinating. Well, let's get into wolves a little bit. Could you start by giving us a brief history of wolves in Minnesota in the upper Midwest?
Yeah, wolves in Minnesota, were here prior to colonization or settlement, and like many other places across the lower 48, they were persecuted and, nearly eliminated by the early 1900s. Probably, were eliminated from the southern part of the state. By the 90s, were kind of isolated further north. We had, kind of some of the same activities in Minnesota that were happening in other places where there were bounties for wolves. Minnesota allowed aerial hunting up until about 1955. The bounty was in place until 1965. At its lowest point, there were probably somewhere between 350 or 500 wolves kind of isolated in the northern border counties of the state. So, St. Louis, Lake, Cook, Couchiching, kind of across that area of the state. But once those activities were removed, and there was really no longer any incentive for people to go out and kill wolves. And at the same time, we still had a directed predator control program. So there was allowance for killing wolves that were causing problems with livestock. And, we were still killing wolves, about 200 a year up until the early 70s. But once, aerial hunting was banned and the bounties were removed, the wolf population started to increase again.
Can you clarify aerial hunting? That's not helicopters, is it? You just mean from an elevated tree stand, or what?
No,
what is it?
Fixed wing plane.
Shooting wolves from planes.
Fly over the top of them and shoot them with buckshot.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
So that was banned in the 70s, you're saying?
No, 1950s.
50s. Okay.
Yeah. So the population started to increase. By the early 70s, it was estimated to be around 700 to 1,000 wolves in Minnesota, and still, kind of those northern border counties. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed. And in 1974, wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so they were fully protected as endangered. And that allowed, a little bit quicker expansion in range and population numbers. In 1978, because we had a, pretty healthy wolf population, they reclassified wolves in Minnesota to threatened. So there's two classifications under the Endangered Species Act. There's endangered, which means that the species is at risk of becoming extinct. So there's more protection in place. And then threatened, they're still at risk of being endangered, but there's more flexibility for managing wolves and or other species that are listed as threatened. And in Minnesota, that allowed for taking wolves or killing wolves that were causing or killing livestock. And that's essentially been in place since 1978. And through that time, wolves pretty rapidly expanded in both range and numbers up until the late 1990s. And prior to 1978, those population estimates that I gave were probably more subjective. There wasn't really a systematic approach to estimating wolf numbers. A lot of that information that was used was based on reports from conservation officers, the wolves that were collected that were killed through the predator control program, and some work out there on the ground trying to get an idea of where wolves are and how many there are. But in the late 1970s, the DNR adopted a more systematic survey to estimate wolf numbers. And that was done about every 10 years up until the late 1990s. And then it was increased to about every 5 years. That methodology has had some modification, but it's essentially been consistent through time. And what we do is we determine wolf range based on observations during those winters that we're doing the survey, and we ask all the natural resource agencies in the state to report sign and observation of wolves and how many they see, and we record all that information and kind of maintain that in a database. And that kind of gives us a coarse distribution of the area that wolves occupy. And then the other part of it is using radio collared wolves. So we trap primarily with foothold traps, put a radio collar on them and track them throughout, determine the territory size, and then in the winters count how many wolves are in those packs. And that's done primarily by flying and locating those packs and then counting the number of wolves in those packs.
Got it. So you get a collared wolf, and then you assume it's going to pack up or like get with a pack. You locate that and then count all the wolves around it from an aerial view.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And we do that with, a limited number of wolves because we can't trap and radio collar all of them. So we try to get enough of a sample that is representative of the areas of the state where wolves are. So that might be 40 to 50 different packs. And that's done with, the cooperation of other agencies or people that are doing research with wolves. So we get the information from all those different groups that are working on that. And we had one of the longest studies of wolves in North America up in the Superior National Forest that Dave Meach did from starting in the late 1960s just up until about 2 years ago. It was about 50 years of a continuous study of wolf population dynamics and predation and things like that, where we can collaborate with others that are gathering that information. We utilize that too. And so that's expanded to some of the tribal natural resource agencies that are radio collaring wolves and tracking them for different purposes. Voyagers Wolf Project now that's doing work up near Voyagers National Park. We've had a site on Camp Ripley that's been utilized since 1990s in kind of the western part of Wolf Range or west central part of the state over by Itasca State Park and Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge, and then another site kind of near Mille Lacs Wildlife Management Area that we've been collaring wolves for about 10 years now.
So what's happened?
Try to get an area, that's representative of all the different places where we find wolves in Minnesota.
So you said there was a strong growth of the population until the 90s. What happened between the 90s and now with the population?
Yeah, so the kind of limiting factors of where wolves are in the state seems to be tied to human activities. So where we have more roads or a higher density of roads, higher human population densities, more agricultural activity, wolves just don't seem to do as well there or spend as much time there. And, even though our wolf population, as it expanded kind of south and west from those northern counties, it didn't continue out into more of the agricultural areas or even into the Dakotas, but it was going into northern Wisconsin and the UP of Michigan. And, as it pretty much occupied all those areas in Minnesota that have been pretty well established now for a couple of decades, it quickly, kind of shifted east into Wisconsin. They had a pretty rapid expansion of the wolf population. These first started showing up in the early 80s, but that just kind of accelerated in the 90s. And by the late 1990s, those populations were well established.
Yeah, I lived that a little bit. I mean, I started hunting when I was 12, which must have been 2000 or something like that. And I primarily hunted in Bayfield County in Wisconsin, and wolves weren't really even a conversation. But now, having spotted a few, seen a few while I've been rifle hunting in Wisconsin in the last 5 years, and more reports and discussion about that helps me understand. Because what you're saying is that as more population came in, as the population dispersed a little bit, do I understand you saying in that kind of...
the dispersers are kind of the founders
of those populations in northern Wisconsin. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. Dispersal's a whole nother topic that's probably not fully understood and is difficult to document and study. But yeah, that's kind of how those populations get first recolonized, and then get established. So I'm kind of getting off track a little bit into the details of the wolf population monitoring and estimates that we do. From a population perspective, by the late 90s, we estimated about 2,500 wolves in Minnesota, and there was probably 100 wolves in each of Wisconsin and Michigan, maybe 200, somewhere between there. Since that time, Minnesota's wolf population has been relatively stable in both the distribution and how many there are. We see some variation from year to year in our population estimates, but at the highest estimate, we estimated there were 3,020 wolves, and that was in the winter of 2003 and 2004. And since that time, we've been between 2,200 and about 2,009. There are some places where wolves show up and kind of get established or might form a new pack and have pups, but those packs don't always persist. They end up getting into conflicts with people. So they might kill livestock, they might kill pets. And, that's been a pretty consistent pattern over time because wolves just need a lot of space that, doesn't have those disruptions in kind of human activity. And that's better represented in kind of the central to the northern part of the state where we have more public lands, less agricultural activity, and relatively lower human density and road density. But wolves tend to do pretty well in most places. They're not really habitat specialists. They're kind of more habitat generalists, and where the prey and not too many of them get killed, they do pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of been the pattern for wolves in Minnesota. And we have the largest wolf population in the lower 48 states, being right around 3,000 wolves. That is nearly twice the number of any other single state, and probably at times it's been, nearly half the population of wolves in the lower 48. One thing about our wolf population survey that, I think is something to clarify for people, it's done in the winter months. And there's two reasons for that. One, there's no tree canopy. So observing wolves is easier, and snow conditions help with those observations. It's also the time of year where the wolf population is probably the most stable. So, our estimate is kind of considered a midwinter estimate, and that happens before pups are born in the spring. And, that's when the population kind of explodes, could nearly double because, on average, we probably have somewhere around 500 packs in Minnesota. Average litter size is about 5 pups to a pack. And so, packs having 5 pups each, that can double the population. And then, of course, there's individual wolves that are kind of roaming around that, aren't tied necessarily to a pack. As they reach a breeding age, they'll leave their pack and they'll disperse, and they go out there and kind of do what we were talking about with cougars earlier. And they'll disperse. They're out there looking for an area that's unoccupied by other wolves where they can kind of fit in, but they're also looking for a mate that they can pair up with and breed and get established. And so when that happens, they might, because most of the northern part of the state isn't, it's already fully occupied, they might find a little area where they can kind of fit in, but then through time, as that pack increases, their needs kind of increase too. They're trying to feed more mouths, and they maybe don't get in trouble right away, but end up getting into some conflicts.
Yeah. What's the survival rate for pups in the first year?
It's a good question. I don't think we have a definitive answer, but it's probably somewhere around 50% or less. Earlier, studies were done to try to get an idea of that, and they based it on, the average pack size. And so each winter, you're counting a pack, expecting that some of those animals are young of the year, or pups, and basing how many others might disperse, you're kind of coming up with a survival rate of maybe 2 or 3 of those wolves are actually pups of the year. And then the rest of the makeup of a pack is usually a male and a breeding male and female and their offspring from a couple of litters. And, as those wolves get older, it tends to be, only a couple of years where those packs stick around, where those other wolves stick around. And then, mortality is pretty high for wolves in general. In the last couple of years, we've summarized data in Minnesota that, the survival rates. So, based on mortality of radio-collared wolves, and on average, the survival rate over that period was about 65%, and a high of, right around 80%, and a low of, closer to 50%. And so, wolves are already out there trying to, get by, and it's a challenge. I think that they are pretty resilient, don't get me wrong, but they're also, out there trying to kill prey that are at least 2 times their size. They're trying to navigate areas that have, roads and humans. And so mortality rates for wolves can be pretty high, but all those factors go into the population dynamics between, mortality, dispersal, reproduction, all that influences it. And it seems to be relatively balanced at where we're at, but it also is influenced by prey density and prey that's out there on the landscape. And so you'll see higher survival rates when, deer numbers are high and deer population is really productive. And then you see lower survival rates when the deer population is down because they need to travel further to put food in their mouths.
So I think what part of what I hope in having you on the pod is for you to speak a little bit into the tension that certainly is out there for hunters, because they come with a perspective. The story that I've heard most often is like the grandpa who has been hunting his whole life, who has been going to the same place, let's say central Minnesota, and has seen a marked decline in the deer population and a perceived increase in the wolf population. I think just out there, if you're grabbing a beer at a bar talking about wolves, you might hear something like, oh, the population's 3 times what the DNR says it is. So you're pretty confident through your data that it's been pretty stable. What explanation would you have to offer that experience of seeing a decline in deer and an increase in wolves? I think you've hinted at a few of those things, but if you were, grabbing, I don't know if you're a beer drinker, I'm not saying you are, but if you were around that bar, and you overheard that conversation, what would you want to infuse in it, so that there's deeper understanding of the wolf population as it relates to the deer population in northern Minnesota?
Yeah, we can look at it a couple of different ways. And I think first off, we got to look at, what the history of deer in Minnesota is to kind of get a broad perspective of that. And so if you look back over so acknowledging that we don't have good estimates and haven't really come up with estimates of the deer population. Usually we track deer numbers or trends based on indices, and one of those is hunter harvest. So if you go back over the last 100 years and you look at how many deer are killed by hunters in the state, that pretty rapidly increased from the 1920s up until and through the 1960s. And what changed on the landscape was the habitat conditions. We changed the landscape in northern Minnesota that allowed deer to expand into an area that they weren't, well established. Of course, there were always probably some deer in the northern part of the state, but we've had some influence on that based on pretty extensive.
Yeah. Do you mean we added food source with agriculture so the deer population flourished or what do you mean by
agriculture? That? We pretty intensively logged the northern part of the state.
Mm-hmm.
That young aspen forest is pretty highly productive for deer, especially that first couple, 2-3 years, it's just kind of like ice cream out there for deer. They're just
Totally.
eating it up.
Yep.
It kind of opened up the landscape and created a very productive environment for deer to just take off. The population exploded. We went from probably about an annual harvest of around 20,000 deer in the state to somewhere over 100,000 deer taken by hunters over that 50-year period. And then we had some changes to that, right? Those forests that had been pretty intensively logged were starting to come back, maturing forests, not as productive for deer. We had some pretty significant winters during that time. The deer population tanked again to the point where they closed it in 1971. There was, that was at the time a concern that, deer numbers weren't going to rebound because we had killed too many of them, and they just weren't seeing, even with reduced bag limits or, bucks only types of approaches, it took time. But with those changes, there was also, again, kind of this, infusion of more industrial type logging practices. Again, kind of saw this boom in deer numbers that kind of grew up through the 80s and into the 90s. And then we had another kind of cycle of severe winters to the point where we saw one of the lowest deer harvests in 1995 and 1996, where we only had about, at least I'm also going to structure this around the Northeast deer permit areas. Some people might be familiar with that as Zone 1 or the 100 series deer permit areas. That's the area of like northeast, north central Minnesota that's kind of consistently had wolves since this time. And also, it coarsely tracks with some of the wolf distribution at that time, but also is just one area where you kind of see this dynamic between changes in winter severity and deer harvest that have had some influence. So I want to go back a little bit to the more broad, hunter harvest across the state. So again, kind of a boom, went back down. And then again, we saw a boom following that where we had these kind of severe winters. Deer numbers were really low. We changed a lot of the deer permit areas to bucks only. When I say we, I'm just saying that we, right?
Yeah.
Like, I wasn't directly involved in any of this because I was still in college. Following that, we saw another rapid increase in deer numbers. The late 90s, early 2000s, up until about 2004, which was the highest number of deer taken in a single year, about 280,000 deer harvested by hunters. So really, successful high hunting harvest. And then, then the department started talking about, okay, there's concerns about impacts to, agriculture and impacts to forest practices, and there's too many deer getting into people's gardens and, things like that. And so we had pretty intensive harvests following that, maybe to the point where it wasn't backed off soon enough. And so we got to a point where deer numbers are down. We had some more severe winters, kind of that 2013-14 period. And we've kind of been in the relatively same level of deer harvest since then. We haven't seen that high level that we saw in the early 2000s. And then, since then we've backed off on a lot of areas now. Are bucks only, at least in the northern part of the state. That hasn't had the response that, everybody would like it to. We've also seen, not counting these last two winters, the decade prior to that, we've had eight of the 10 years had some of the snowiest conditions on record. So even though it maybe hasn't been as cold, we have seen deep snow conditions. And that impacts deer because it's harder for them to get around. It's harder for them to get access to food. And there's also been some changing forestry conditions. Deer need Deer need two things. They need a good food source, and they also need conditions that help them, escape those deep snows, because what happens in those deep snows is not only is it harder for them to get food, but they're also more vulnerable to predation.
Mm-hmm.
So predation rates are directly tied to winter severity. And so when we have some of the more severe winters, wolves are a bigger factor.
Severe specifically with the snow volume, because it's harder for deer to escape.
Yeah, snow and cold. If it's a combination of the winter severity is measured by those two things. So that's one index that we have, but deep snow seems to be a bigger factor than the cold.
Got it.
So, I think roughly that gets us to today. We've been at the point now for, 5 years where we've had relatively conservative deer harvests. And, we saw a change from the 2023 season to the 2024 season, where we had about 7% more deer harvested. But we're still taking 150 to 170,000 deer a year, statewide. And there are places in the state where, deer are relatively abundant. They're causing concerns for, people that are trying to farm crops and things like that. And, and then we have other places in northern Minnesota that have just become, relatively few deer compared to previous years. And a big factor in that is kind of a changing landscape. And so you got to not just, is there young forest that's productive for deer, but also those habitats that allow them to escape those deep winters. And so we used to have more of a mix of that on the landscape with upland cedar, kind of those conifer conditions that help them get out of that, but also the age classification of, aspen. If we allow that to get older, some of that understory starts to come up. That's probably a better for deer to escape some of those conditions too. But if you just kind of have that uniform landscape of aspen that's, 10 to 40 years old, probably not all that great for deer. And so we got to have a good balance and mix of that for deer to be productive. And that's the reality of deer, right? We're kind of on their northern range in Minnesota. And I don't want to dismiss wolves as a component of it, are a component of the mortality. We talked about the predation rates that increase in those winters. We've also had a recent study that has been summarized but hasn't been fully published that we observed some of those predation rates that were higher than what we saw in some of those severe winters. And I think that's a factor of us having, a lower deer density. And so fewer deer on the landscape. And wolves are going to try to, resist that decline because they're out there trying to find enough food to, survive and get by. And so with a healthy, resilient wolf population out there, the percentage of deer on the landscape that they're killing is going to be higher when deer numbers are low than when deer numbers are high.
Just so you're saying that because the predation, the motivation of the wolf population stays steady, even though the deer population fluctuates, you're going to get a higher kill percentage on the lower years, meaning more percentage of the herd is going to get killed by predators because they hunt about the same. And then
it's dependent on how many deer are on the landscape, right?
Got it.
They're not necessarily going to increase their predation rates. They're going to still be killing at the same rate, but
it's just a higher percent of the population
that are being taken is going to be higher because they require certain, they still have certain nutritional needs that they're trying to meet.
So is there concern for particular pockets of the state where you have a steady wolf population, but a deer population taking that chunk of a percentage, like for that deer population in that area, to kind of tank because that's an unsustainable. Talk about that a little.
Yeah, I don't think it's tanking because wolves are there. It's tanking because the landscape isn't productive enough for deer to rebound outside of the level of wolf predation that's influencing that, right? So
yeah,
if an
you're
area,
saying
if there's low productivity for deer on the landscape, it probably doesn't matter whether wolves are there or not. I mean, we could take wolves out of the equation, and maybe deer would creep up a little bit quicker.
okay, yeah,
But if the habitat conditions are good, wolves can't keep up with that. And we saw that. We saw that in the late 90s and early 2000s. Like, you got this highly productive landscape where deer numbers are just booming. And our wolf population at the same time was at its highest point. So they the wolf population is probably somewhat reflective of how many deer are out there. And eventually there's going to be some of this cycling happening where deer numbers boom, wolf numbers kind of follow it up, deer numbers tank, wolf numbers are kind of following it down. But if that habitat isn't there to support that rebound in deer numbers, they're just going to kind of plateau. And so it gets pretty complicated. And I think it's sometimes it's just equated to wolves versus deer.
Yeah.
And that's just not the reality of it. It's more complicated than that. Now, on some level, right, if based on this spatial and, temporal aspects of it, you can look at it from, okay, I hunt this area. This year there were, a pack of wolves hanging out, and it seemed like it just disrupted the deer activity in my area. But does that happen every year? Probably. I mean, it could, but wolf packs on average cover about 40 to 50 square miles. And so you got 5 wolves in a pack, and if they happen to be in the area that you're hunting that weekend, yeah, it could have some influence on deer activity. Maybe they're more vigilant, maybe they're not using the same travel corridors, or
yeah,
it kind of throws things off that you're used to seeing. But statewide or even wolf range wide, wolves are a component, but they're typically, at least based on what we've observed, are not the driving factor in deer harvest in Minnesota.
Got it.
Again, we've got areas of the state where we have wolves, and those deer populations are just kind of going gangbusters because it's mostly influenced by the habitat. And you see where deer numbers get really high is there's kind of that mix of, forest and agricultural activity, and you also see deer just growing faster, getting bigger, because they have better nutrition. Yeah, northern Minnesota used to be one of those kind of dominant areas for big bucks and stuff, but probably most of the areas now are hunted more heavily than they were historically, and there aren't a lot of places where deer are allowed to get old enough to grow big antlers, and we've got a limited resource that there's a lot of interest in hunting because of, there's a lot of access. People have access to a lot of public lands in northern Minnesota.
Yeah.
And there are other species, though, that wolves prey on, right? They prey on moose. And in Minnesota, they may be having more influence on moose than they are on deer. And how that dynamic has evolved over time is also, I think, kind of a complicated number of different things that influence that. We had higher deer harvests. Maybe that kind of artificially influenced wolf density. We intentionally reduced deer numbers because of the transmission of, disease that affects moose that deer carry, that it doesn't affect deer. And as that kind of played out, maybe there was some more impact to moose because wolf densities were really high. And at least now the moose population appears to have stabilized a bit and isn't on as rapid a decline as we thought a decade ago. But there's certainly a factor, and especially for moose calf mortality. And, one of the studies that was done documented that 2/3 of the calves were being killed by wolves. And so if you don't have enough recruitment and animals that are replacing those animals that are dying, that can be hard to sustain a population. So
Got it.
it's a pretty dynamic thing, right? It's not a static, this many deer and this many wolves. And if you remove one portion of it, the other one's going to increase because, we're not considering all the other factors that are influencing that, from habitat and winter severity and also hunter harvest. So it's got to be kind of a balance of those things.
I have a ton of questions for sure, but let's just because I'm genuinely curious, and let's just stick to hunting though. I think there's a lot of confusion and just like the simple question, why can't we hunt wolves in Minnesota right now? Like maybe that's an elemental question, but what are the factors, whether they're legal, political, or otherwise, that prohibit us having one of the management mechanisms being hunters in Minnesota?
Yeah. So the primary thing that is preventing the ability to have a season is that they're listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't have a season until they're taken off that list.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people could say, well, you could have a season, you just might lose federal funding or something like that, or the state could have a season regardless of that. But we also have a state law that says the DNR can have a season, but the wolf has to be removed from the list prior to that happening. So
there's a state law that stipulates the federal law needs to change prior to there being a season. Got it.
Yeah. And then, for a little bit of history, that a lot of people probably aren't aware of, the department actually proposed a season back in the early 90s. And we said, we have a healthy wolf population. It's met the criteria that was established under the endangered species or the recovery plan for wolves. So the recovery plan for wolves is every species that's listed under the Endangered Species Act has a recovery plan that's written that are kind of the goals established for when those are met, the species would be considered for being taken off the list.
So those numbers, like for what?
For Minnesota or for the eastern timber wolf, which is what the recovery plan was written for, it was to have at least 1,250 to 1,400 wolves in Minnesota to assure their survival, and to have at least 100 wolves outside of Minnesota in another place. So Minnesota had met, pretty much that goal, at least for the Minnesota portion. As I had mentioned earlier, we estimated there were about 1,250 wolves in 1978.
Mm-hmm.
So, there'd been a history of at least hunting and trapping wolves in Minnesota, not through a regulated season, but, there had been experience of being able to trap wolves in Minnesota. Prior to that, they weren't protected before they were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so there was a proposal to have a season. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agreed with that. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the agency that administers the Endangered Species Act. They do a lot of other things too. They manage national wildlife refuges, but for this portion of it, they administer the Endangered Species Act, and they agreed with that. They published a rule that would allow for a limited take by the public in Minnesota. We'd have a limited season here. And that was in 1983. That was immediately challenged and went to court and got overruled. And so it never got implemented. And so essentially they said, well, you can't have a season on a species that's listed under the Endangered Species Act. So there is some precedent that would prohibit that.
So it's not, they're staring at that, and someone would say, well, why don't you just do it? And you're like, there's legal precedent for it immediately being overturned by the court based on that previous ruling. There's precedent that because as long as the federal law is in place, there's precedent for someone to just sue and overturn it, you're saying.
Right. And I think, given the history of wolves listed under the Endangered Species Act, if the state proposed having a season now, being that they're listed as threatened, it probably wouldn't be supported because of that. So the best option is for this to play out and get them off the list so that there is an option to do that.
So let's go down that road hypothetically now. So they come off the federal list. You stated that it's about 1,200 ish that is a quote unquote healthy population with an existing population outside of that. Sounds like Wisconsin's got us covered, or North Dakota with that, right?
Well, that's the Minnesota portion.
So
before we jump to that,
yeah, go ahead.
Wolves were first taken off the endangered species list in Minnesota in 2007. Mm-hmm. And the approach that was taken at the time was the proposal for delisting was that they identified this area that included Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Mm-hmm. And they said that this population is recovered and no longer needs to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. So we're going to remove wolves from the list in this area.
In this zone.
Well, when wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act or reclassified in 1978, they were listed as threatened in Minnesota. So let's keep that in mind. Like Minnesota has a distinct, entity that's listed. Mm-hmm. And then they were listed everywhere else in all the other 47 states as endangered. Okay. And so when they proposed that in 2007 or 2006 and it took effect in 2007, the challenge that took place following that was that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service violated the Endangered Species Act by carving out this area and saying that it doesn't need protection while everywhere else wasn't addressed. And they said that you can't do that. That's what the court essentially said. You can't create an entity and say they're no longer protected when they were originally listed across the whole lower 48 states. And so that's, these challenges, it's one example, but that's been 3 other delisting decisions and court challenges that have put them back on the list. And so it hasn't been based on the conservation of the species, at least in the regions that they've been delisted. It's been on kind of more the administration of the Endangered Species Act. And so you can list a species under the Endangered Species Act. You can enlist a subspecies, or you can list a distinct population segment. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what the legislation says.
Did I pick up in what you said, though, that Minnesota has a distinction in that because we were classified differently?
Yeah. So what the rule says is that Minnesota is, for the purposes of the Endangered Species Act, the Minnesota gray wolf group is a distinct entity under the Endangered Species Act.
So hypothetically, could whoever delist that specific population, that just hasn't been tried in the courts you're talking about?
One more thing I'm going to add before we talk about that is that when Minnesota was listed separately, that was before there was a change to the ESA, which said that you could list a species, a subspecies, or a distinct population segment. And they've never corrected that listing for Minnesota. So we are the Minnesota Gray Wolf Group. It's a distinct entity under the Endangered Species Act. And so one thing that we did in 2010, because wolves had gone back on the list after one of those decisions, the state petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to delist. And we said, because Minnesota is a distinct entity, they can be removed or declassified and taken off the list. Mm-hmm. And so the response to that was that has merit, but we're already going through this process to delist again based on the Western Great Lakes area. So it's precluded by us already doing this. And then they came off the list. So we proposed that in 2010. They proposed the rule in 2011. They said, yes, we agree there's merit there, but we're already trying to remove them this other way.
So
they
they
came
picked
off
their
the list.
battle basically, and they picked not yours or not
Well,
Minnesota's.
they took a different approach.
Yep.
It seemed like uh, an appropriate approach, right?
Sure.
There was a population in the Great Lakes that, has well established, it's recovered. And so they were trying to take an approach that they thought was appropriate based on the conservation of the species. And that's when they came off the list in 2012 and were off the list between 2012, 13, and 14. The state of Minnesota had seasons on wolves during that time. So we had a season in 2012, 13, and 14. But then subsequently they went back on the list because of another court challenge following kind of a similar, challenge based on, what we talked about before.
So what happened in that season? Were you working on this during that time frame, and what did you learn from hunters being a factor in the conservation of wolves?
We'd never had a regulated hunting and trapping season for wolves in Minnesota prior to that. Mm-hmm. Wolves were unprotected prior to 1974. And so there was some allowance for take. People could trap or shoot a wolf, except in the Superior National Forest, because prior to the Endangered Species Act, there was another federal law that, federal agencies, land management agencies could protect species. And so that kind of restricted any take of wolves, at least within the Superior National Forest. And so one of the things that we want to make sure that we have good information on hunting success, trapping success, being able to control some of the variables that we weren't quite sure of. If we just had an unlimited season, we don't want to run the risk of having a population that gets impacted too much through hunting mm-hmm. and trapping.
Sure.
We wanted to make sure we could gather good information. And that included, some, unlike other seasons, where we set a kind of a time frame and then allow people to buy licenses and hunt that period. Mm-hmm. We kind of wanted to have a mechanism that we could close the season if it hit a number that we thought was, appropriate for the level of the number of wolves being killed by hunters and trappers. And so that was kind of unique where, if we hit this target level, we would announce the season closure and people would have to stop trapping and hunting. But we ran it, similar to some of our other seasons where it was a limited lottery. People had to apply and be able to be selected in that lottery to purchase a license. And there was also a requirement through state law that said that we had to start the season at the same time that we start the firearms deer season.
Okay.
And so we structured it in a way that there were kind of two seasons. One that coincided with the firearms deer season. Mm-hmm. And so if people wanted to hunt wolves, they could apply and be selected in the lottery and then hunt during that period. Most of the people that hunted that season, it was probably more opportunistic, where they're sitting in their deer stand hunting deer. And if a wolf goes by, they'd
take it.
Kill it. Yeah. And then we had a second season. So later season, similar to how our, like our bobcat season is, people can hunt bobcats for a certain time frame. And then the trapping season occurred at that same time. So people could purchase a license or, again, be selected in the lottery and purchase a license. And then they'd either have to identify whether they're going to hunt or trap. And so we kind of split, the number of licenses based on, or we awarded licenses proportional to the people that put in for either hunting or trapping. And so, people that are hunting during that time maybe hunted a little bit differently, not just opportunistically. Yeah. They were probably either, you could hunt over bait. So you could, if you had a carcass and you wanted to sit and wait and wolves were coming into that, you could do that. Or you could, call mm-hmm. or hunt, maybe opportunistically if they wanted to. And then trapping was open during that same period. So people set traps and multiple places and kind of like they would any other fur bearer. So what we observed was that hunting wolves isn't easy. Success rates for people with a license during the firearms deer season was probably less than 5%. Hunters in the late season were a little bit more successful, but not much. It was still relatively low. And then trappers' success rates were higher. Initially, the first year, about 30% of the trappers were successful in taking a wolf. But that first year, we had set the target harvest at about 400 wolves. We killed 413 wolves that year. And then
it was open all the time. You didn't close it down prior to the anticipated end, or
during the firearms portion, it was open. The firearms deer season, it was open that entire
month period or
whatever it is.
Yeah.
The late season, we closed, I think the first year it was by mid-January. So we did have to close it a little early. It was open through January 1st unless we reached that.
Yeah, cool.
And then each year that changed a little bit. So the firearms season, by the third year, we had to close it a day early because we hit the target harvest. And then the late season, where we were both trapping or hunting, we're allowed that. I think that third year, it was only open for about 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if Minnesota is afforded the legal window to have a season, do you feel like it would be the same approach? Do you find that period successful? Is there things that you all imagine hypothetically doing differently if that was open to you?
Yeah, I think we've outlined that pretty well in our wolf management plan, that we would it would initially be a similar approach. Wolves have been hunted and trapped in a lot of different states now, and well, not a lot. The Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho have a season for wolves. There's obviously been hunting and trapping in Canada that's been ongoing, and that's different for each province, but probably similar approaches. The thing that I think is different for Minnesota, that, the progression of some of the seasons out west have been more liberal, because of the difficulty in being able to hunt and trap wolves. But until we have good, solid, consistent information over time, we're probably not going to diverge, at least from the approach that we've kind of outlined.
Makes sense.
Eventually, it's going to be progressive. I think it'll be, based on information that we can gather over time to make adjustments to it.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to equate the delisting to immediately hunting and trapping of wolves either, right? Like, we first should be trying to find a path to recognize the recovery of a significant conservation effort that has happened, and, respect that we've been successful with that. And at the same time, people that have concerns about impacts to deer and other prey, like hunting and trapping wolves isn't going to have the results that they might think it's going to have. It's not going to be like an overnight change in how many deer are out there.
Yeah. Say more about that. What?
Well,
I think the simplistic thing is like, let us hunt them. We'll take care of it if they're picking off pets or destroying cattle. But
yeah, but at the same time, people that are concerned about wolves being taken off the endangered species list and there being allowance for hunting and trapping does not mean that they're going to be driven back to extinction either, right? So, like, both these arguments are not, it's hard for people to reconcile those differences. And I think, like, that's where we need to agree that wolves have recovered. It's been a great success, and we need to find something moving forward that matches the reality of wolves on the landscape.
Yeah.
They're, resilient. There's a healthy population. It could allow some outdoor hunting and trapping activity that a lot of people in Minnesota support and want to have opportunities to do that. And so the respect for the species has to be there. It can't be just because we need to kill them.
Yeah, they can't be seen as a nuisance exclusively. So what I've gained from this conversation is that you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would see a path in which we can do things to increase the deer population through habitat and other things, understanding that wolves do have an impact on that, but not the impact on that, and simultaneously have a management approach, hypothetically, where we're not going to wipe out all, like, hunters with pitchforks aren't going to come wipe out all the work that you've done over the 30 years. Like, there's a way to manage that as an aspect of conservation, wherein, and hypothetically, the best case scenario would be a presumed increase in deer population, because that only helps a wolf population hypothetically. And in addition to that, some factor of the management of the wolves being harvesting through hunters. That would be an ideal scenario, hypothetically, unless you're completely opposed to hunting.
Yeah.
Is that a future that you all are contemplating working towards? Or is that, how does that fit into what your ideal is?
Well, I think that's a goal for any species that has an interest from people that want to do that, and it can be supported from. The answer to the question is, there's kind of two different questions, right? Can there be a hunting season, or can there be a season for wolves? Based on all the information that we have and the data that indicates wolf populations can be sustained, and we can have a responsible approach to hunting and trapping that species without, and mitigate the risks. Like, yes, that's a possibility. But what people don't agree with is, should there be a season? And that's what, that's where all the different human values come into play. And there's a varying degree of what people think about that. And so I don't, I don't have a concern from a biological standpoint and a population standpoint about hunting and trapping wolves, but we need to do it in a way that is acceptable by our society, and we need to find a way to do it respectfully, responsibly. And I think that's finding the people that have the right approach to that. You guys are, I'm sure, familiar with the North American model of wildlife management, right? And it says hunting or trapping needs to be done for a legitimate purpose. Okay, people need to identify what that legitimate purpose is, and if that's their view of it, then find a approach that is acceptable by the general public to do that. Because over time, we've seen declining interests, declining support. There are a lot of different things that influence how we manage and conserve species on the landscape. And, I'm sure you guys have had conversations about it too. The base of hunters and trappers is, in general, it's been declining.
Yeah. Is predation on the deer population that legitimate reason that you say is necessary?
Well, the legitimate reason isn't for me to decide. That's a societal value that people need to identify. What I'm going to look at it from is, can the population withstand or support these activities? And currently,
impact on them.
The evaluation and assessment is yes.
Dan, this has been super helpful. I've got a lot more questions, but I want to respect your time too. I've got one specific question, and then if you want to add anything else in, I'm happy to give you space to do that. The one specific question, I've heard this multiple times. It's been stated on our podcast in reference to wolves, because it's the felt experience of a lot of our audience. I know it's in Wisconsin, which is not your zone, but there is, it's been stated there was a wolf population in Wisconsin that was active for like 24 hours. And then the quota was filled and they shut it down. And this is a narrative that I haven't certified those facts, but I'm assuming they're true because I've heard it a bunch of times. And how that's interpreted by hunters is like, well, gosh, there's way more wolves out there than the DNR is stating, because we met the quota that fast. Just respond to that. Is that the right way to think about that? Is there more that is misunderstood in that story that's being told? What would you say?
I don't think that the rate and speed at which those wolves were killed is an indication of population size. I mean, if that's the, it's a number of things, right? It's how many hunters are out there? What types of methods are they utilizing? What are the conditions that allow them to, focus on wolves and be successful? All those factors play into it. The quota or the goals that are set based on, estimates of the population size. And just because you reach that in an amount of time doesn't mean that the population size is bigger than that.
Okay.
There's other factors that influence it. And, ideally, if you know what the success rates are, you can kind of help inform how fast you think the quota might be reached. But I think, again, there's kind of limited experience with that, at least in the Midwestern states or the Great Lakes states.
So
if we opened up a season and allowed anybody to shoot a wolf that had a deer license, I don't know how many wolves we would kill, but I wouldn't use that information to say that is a metric of the population. It's a metric of how successful the hunters and trappers are using the methods that they're using.
Yeah. So how, based on what you just said, what's a way to understand what happened in Wisconsin with it closing in a day like that?
Well, I think it was 3 days.
Okay.
My recollection of it was like 3 days, but yeah, they had the right conditions for one. I think they just had a fresh snow, and so tracking wolves and identifying wolves is easier. They also were allowed the use of hounds, which is something that was the only state that I'm aware of that allows that. So, if you're able to trail the wolf by the use of, with that aid, it might have accelerated the number of wolves taken over a shorter period than what they were expecting. I don't know that was allowed in any of the other years that they've had a season. So that might have been something new that, was kind of an unknown.
Sure. Good.
Yeah, I haven't fully evaluated that or talked to those biologists about it that have worked there. They might have a different understanding of it or thoughts about it.
Yeah.
We did collect a lot of information on wolves that were hunted and trapped just so we could have a better understanding of some of the demographics of wolves on the landscape. Well, every wolf that somebody killed during the season, they had to bring it in person for us to be able to inspect it, and we collected samples from it. And so we looked at age, sex, reproductive status. So with females, you can remove the uterus and look for placental scars. And so those placental scars are where an embryo was attached. And it's an indication of birth rate or reproduction. So a lot of that information was pretty informative. It gave us new data that we didn't have available to us before. And eventually, it's one of those things that if, like we do for our bear season, we use the age of bears based on their teeth that are submitted by hunters to complete a population model. So we don't do a population estimate for bears. We have a model that's based on the age of bears that are taken during the season. So it's another method to look at population, and we do that for bobcats in Minnesota. So it's another method of tracking the population and making sure that we're, not killing too many. And we can set seasons based on that and, have a sustainable, conservation of the species. Yeah. And there's probably a lot of other things that we could talk about, but hopefully that gives you guys a little bit more information about the topic and the subject and the history of it.
Yeah.
And it's not new, right? The angst from deer hunters. I mean, this isn't new. It's happened at these periods where the deer population has been low. Some of the organizations that are based in Minnesota are based on some of those times where they had concerns about where the deer numbers were, and they rallied and organized and influenced some of the the management of those species. And so, it's good to hear from people and try to work and find solutions and opportunities where there's, places to improve both hunting, conservation, but also I think doing it in a way that is kind of looking at the bigger picture in relation to our society and making sure that we're doing it in a way that, has kind of more long-term effects and isn't just kind of a knee-jerk reaction to what they're seeing, at the current time.
I know we're almost out of time, but I feel like I want you, if you're willing to represent those perspectives from what you're hearing directly from folks who are opposed to hunting. What are the primary reasons, real quickly, that they would be opposed to hunting? I think our listeners can probably fill that in, but it might be better hearing it from someone who works on this, who hears both from angsty hunters and from others who are bringing concerns.
I can't speak to the perspectives of anti-hunters or wolf advocates or others. I mean, but obviously they have concerns about impacts to the population. I would probably draw a parallel between what happened when wolves were first listed or put on the endangered species list, and people that were living in northern Minnesota that livestock, maybe were a wolf trapper, and like overnight it changed from like these critters aren't even protected. We've got 1,000 of them in the state. Why do we need to put them on the endangered species list? They're not endangered. And like overnight it changed to like, now we can't do anything. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, like we've gone through this 40 years of wolves being protected under the Endangered Species Act. And, maybe some people think that it is a fragile population, that there may be some misunderstanding that hunting or trapping is what caused them to be considered extinct. And that's not the reality. What caused them to be endangered, I should say, is it was our approach to a lot of species. As it was conflicts with agriculture. It was, we had concerns about impacts to the, ungulate species that they impacted. But there was a huge societal shift that, kind of promoted the changes to protecting species. And so now they've been protected for 40 years. And it's a big shift for people to like see them be, go back to being hunted and trapped without kind of having the broader context of it.
Yeah.
We've successfully had conservation of wildlife in place now for many years. And, it's not individuals hunting or trapping wolves that is putting those species at risk. It's those kind of untethered approaches to killing species that has the biggest impact, right? Mm. And so if those risks are, or those things are in place, then there's reason to be concerned. But that's not the reality either.
Yeah.
Right. If we do it in a way that's responsible and can make sure that we still have a healthy population and, wolves are thriving in Minnesota, it adds to the value of wildlife on the landscape, and it makes our places that we hunt. I mean, if you hunt deer, you should respect wolves because, right, those species were shaped because of the ecological relationship between the two. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we need to work into those dialogues about, why we might, or why somebody might want to do that.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thanks so much. I think one of the things that gets lost in all this tension, not only is the details, and that's rife for misunderstanding, but the number of people who work on your team and don't just like clock in and clock out, but care about this stuff. And as the numbers have proved, have been successful in recovering a species that was down and out. So I appreciate your work. Thank you for what you guys do. And thank you for being willing to come on the pod and have an open conversation with us. And thanks for your time, man. Appreciate it.
Yep. Glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
Here's what's next on the Huntxp podcast.
From my own experience, I had never seen a wolf in my life. Hunting, being in the woods from the time I was young all the way through high school. The first time I saw a wolf like a live wolf was when I was in college. I came back and was hunting in northern Wisconsin, and I saw a wolf for the first time. And I see plenty of wolves now. So that's how I know, and it's in the same areas. So that's one thing that I've noticed over the span of my lifetime. And I don't think you can just discredit that. And I think a lot of people have the same story of, hey, there wasn't any wolves. I had never seen them, not many tracks, but now I see wolves, and I see wolf tracks all the time in areas that I hunt now.
Yeah. Yep. I think so. I went into it kind of like, oh, this is what I hear hunters primarily in Wisconsin because I'm connected to that. And then more publicly in Minnesota, I've heard murmurings of that tension and angst. So I think it's very simplistic to go like more wolves, less deer. And I, with you, was kind of like, after talking to Dan, like there is certainly a connection, but it's a little bit more complicated than I had anticipated. And it was interesting to hear those things. I think the overall thing that I'm taking away is I think we just want more deer.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, it is that.
I feel like I found myself as a listener and engaging in the conversation. Like, let's not lose that. Like, we just want more deer. And one of the solutions for more deer could be knocking out a little bit of the predation. Let's not let that detract from the other conversations and things that happen from a conservation perspective that influence deer population. Because I think it would be great if at the federal level, the endangered species was removed and it opened the doors for season. Because I heard loud and clear from someone who's directly managing the wolf population in Minnesota, is like, we're ready for it. We've been ready for it. We've asked for it. Hey there, thanks for watching this video. I'm JD, founder and crew member of the Huntxp team. We're so grateful that you took time to watch this video, and hopefully it's helping you level up your hunting game. That's what we and our community is all about, and we want to invite you into this growing community of hunters. It's all about leveling up each other's hunting game. So the first thing you can do is like and subscribe, but even more than that, we got some fun things going on over at our website, Huntxp.com. We'd love for you to join our community there and stay connected with what we're doing, what we're working on, and we'd love to hear about what you're after. So thank you for watching this video. See you next time.